In contemporary society, questions arise with increasing frequency regarding the psychological mechanisms underlying certain behaviors that seem to operate beyond conscious control. Among the most pressing concerns involves the consumption of explicit visual material and its relationship to fundamental biological imperatives. To understand this phenomenon properly, we must first examine the neural architecture that governs our most basic drives, the ancient circuitry embedded within a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. Structures we inherit at birth that propel us toward behaviors essential for species continuation. Sexual behavior, regardless of one's moral or philosophical perspective, maintains an undeniable connection to reproductive success. This represents not a value judgment, but rather a biological fact. Each person reading these words exists because at some point, genetic material combined in a specific context to create new life. This fundamental reality anchors our discussion in evolutionary biology rather than ideology. The concern that surfaces repeatedly, particularly among younger individuals, though not exclusively limited to this demographic, centers on a troubling pattern. People describe experiencing what begins as a desire but gradually transforms into something altogether different. Compulsion that operates almost beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Find themselves engaging in behaviors they consciously wish to resist, yet feel powerless to stop. Parallel to eating disorders becomes strikingly apparent. They recognize the behavior as problematic, understand they should refrain, yet continue nonetheless. This raises a crucial question that haunts those experiencing such patterns. Does the problem originate externally in the unprecedented availability of stimulating material, or internally, suggesting some fundamental defect in their psychological makeup? In essence, broken. The answer, when examined through the lens of neural circuitry and behavioral psychology, suggests neither simple explanation captures the full picture. Rather than indicating a broken system, these patterns represent the predictable outcome when certain brain regions receive specific patterns of stimulation. Think of it as one aspect of personality, one neural subsystem, gaining disproportionate influence over behavior. Understand how this occurs, we must examine the neurochemistry of reward and reinforcement. When an organism progresses toward achieving a desired goal, the brain releases a chemical messenger called dopamine. This release serves two distinct but interrelated functions. First, it generates the subjective experience of pleasure or satisfaction. Second, and perhaps more importantly for understanding compulsive behavior, dopamine acts as a learning signal. It strengthens whatever neural circuits were active immediately before the rewarding experience occurred. Consider the mechanics in detail as you engage in any behavior that culminates in satisfaction or pleasure. The neural pathways activated during that behavior become reinforced. The dopamine release essentially tells the brain, whatever we were just doing, do more of it. Those circuits are valuable. When someone engages with explicit visual material that culminates in sexual satisfaction through self-stimulation, the entire constellation of neural circuits oriented toward that particular stimulus pattern gets strengthened. The personality subsystem centered on seeking and responding to those specific stimuli gradually comes to dominate the behavioral repertoire. This process shares fundamental similarities with addiction, though important distinctions exist. mechanism resembles addiction in that repeated activation of reward circuits in response to a specific stimulates increasingly automatic behavioral patterns. However, the comparison to research conducted with simpler organisms illuminates additional dimensions of the problem. Scientists studying animal behavior have identified a phenomenon they term supernormal stimuli, artificial stimuli that trigger instinctive responses more powerfully than any naturally occurring stimulus. Classic research with stickleback fish demonstrates this principle elegantly. Male stickleback fish exhibit aggressive territorial behavior toward other males. They identify primarily by the presence of a red marking on the belly. Researchers discovered they could trigger even more intense aggressive responses by presenting an artificial stimulus, a red dot larger and brighter than any that appears naturally on actual fish. Despite being artificial, exceeding anything encountered in the natural environment, this enhanced stimulus proved virtually irresistible, triggering stronger responses than real conspecifics. This concept of supernormal stimuli provides a framework for understanding explicit visual material in the modern context. Material functions as a supernormal stimulus for human sexual response systems. The susceptibility of young males to this particular form of stimulation makes evolutionary sense when we consider that human male sexuality demonstrates strong visual orientation. Our species possesses exceptionally sophisticated visual processing capabilities, more extensive visual cortex than virtually any other animal, certainly surpassing other primates and all other mammals in the proportion of brain tissue devoted to vision. This creates a historically unprecedented situation. Consider this striking contrast: an adolescent boy today with internet access can view more images of exceptionally attractive females exhibiting sexual availability in a single afternoon than the most successful, wealthy, powerful man who lived a century ago would have encountered across his entire lifetime. This represents a radical ecological transformation in the informational environment to which our sexual response systems are exposed. The situation grows more problematic when we factor in accessibility. These supernormal stimuli require virtually no effort to obtain. Actual sexual relationships, which demand social skills, emotional intelligence, risk-taking, and sustained effort, digital explicit material offers instant gratification with minimal expenditure of time or energy. The combination proves particularly potent, a stimulus that triggers response systems more powerfully than natural stimuli available instantly without effort or risk. An instructive parallel exists in the domain of food and eating behavior. Modern, highly processed foods serve as gustatory supernormal stimuli. Consider the combination of sugar and fat, a pairing rarely found in nature in concentrated forms, yet ubiquitous in processed foods. Walking through a typical convenience store reveals the extent of this phenomenon. Products systematically combine not just sugar and fat, add caffeine, artificial colors, and other compounds that enhance their stimulant properties. Chocolate contains caffeine. Beverages combine sugar with caffeine and other stimulants. Nicotine products sit adjacent to energy drinks and sugar-laden snacks. None of these substances necessarily causes harm in isolation, consumed in moderate amounts with adequate spacing. However, their combination and concentration creates something qualitatively different. The parallel to drug development proves instructive Consider the difference between coca leaves, which indigenous populations have chewed for centuries as a mild stimulant without apparent harm, versus purified cocaine, which concentrates the active compounds to potentially devastating effect. Follows a similar pattern. Something available in nature in relatively low concentrations gets extracted, purified, concentrated into forms that can hijack reward systems. The solution, or at least one pathway toward managing these compulsions, emerges from understanding how the brain learns associations between sensory experiences and physiological outcomes. Those who follow relatively unprocessed diets, consuming whole foods without heavy processing or complex combinations, develop something valuable, a learned association between the taste of food, its volume, its macronutrient composition, protein, fat, carbohydrate content, and the subjective experience of satiation. Consider how this learning occurs. When you consume a large portion of a single whole food, a substantial piece of meat, perhaps a large serving of vegetables, your brain receives correlated information from multiple sources. The taste receptors in your mouth provide one stream of data. The volume and physical properties of the food provide another. Then, as digestion proceeds, the gut itself provides crucial feedback about nutritional content. The gastrointestinal tract contains specialized neurons that respond to different nutrients. Some detect sugars, others respond to fatty acids, others signal the presence of amino acids. This gut-level signaling operates through a fascinating neural pathway. Specialized cells in the intestinal lining detect nutrients and communicate this information via the vagus nerve, which projects to a small relay structure called the nodose ganglion before continuing to dopaminergic centers in the brain, the very regions that generate feelings of reward and satisfaction. When you consume food rich in essential amino acids, those building blocks of protein that the body cannot synthesize and must obtain from diet, neurons in your gut signal this fact to reward centers in your brain through pathways completely independent of taste. Here lies a crucial insight. Your mouth can only learn associations between taste and outcomes. Your gut knows the actual nutritional content of what you consume. When these two information streams provide consistent, correlated signals, when foods that taste a certain way reliably contain certain nutrients, the brain can learn accurate predictions. A food that tastes a particular way will satisfy particular nutritional needs, and once those needs are met, appetite diminishes. Highly processed foods, particularly those combining multiple ingredients in complex preparations, make this learning impossible. Brain cannot parse which components of a complex processed food relate to which aspects of subsequent satiation. Multiple neural systems in the hypothalamus and gut activate simultaneously in response to various components, but their signals become mixed, providing no clear information about which specific elements satisfy which specific needs. Research suggests that organisms, humans included, continue eating until they obtain adequate amounts of essential nutrients, particularly essential amino acids and essential fatty acids. Notably, no such thing as an essential carbohydrate exists. Only essential amino acids and essential fatty acids, compounds we must obtain from external sources because our bodies cannot manufacture them. A food item might taste pleasant and contain calories, but provide few or none of these essential building blocks. The appetite systems will continue signaling the need to eat, driving continued consumption because those gut-level sensors never detect adequate amounts of what the body actually requires. This phenomenon of empty calories, foods that provide energy but lack essential micronutrients and macronutrients, keeps appetite systems activated far beyond caloric needs. You experience this if you have ever eaten a substantial, nutritionally complete meal, perhaps a large steak with vegetables, and felt genuinely satiated only to then consume a small amount of refined carbohydrate like pasta or bread. Suddenly, having already consumed adequate protein and calories, the desire for more food returns. Even a single bite of pasta after a satiating meal can trigger renewed appetite. This occurs because refined carbohydrates spike blood glucose. Blood glucose elevation connects directly to dopamine reward systems, triggering the desire for continued consumption regardless of actual nutritional status. This brings us back to the parallel with explicit visual material and sexual behavior. The comparison holds across multiple dimensions. As the evolutionary function of eating involves obtaining nutrients, seer regardless of whatever other meanings or pleasures food might provide it, the evolutionary function of sexual behavior involves reproduction. However, much sexual activity might serve other purposes in human life. These represent biological realities, not moral prescriptions. The modern challenge involves systems evolved for one informational environment now operating in a radically different one. We evolved eating behaviors calibrated to whole foods, providing correlated sensory and nutritional information. We evolved sexual response systems calibrated to real potential mates encountered at evolutionarily normal frequencies. Both systems now confront supernormal stimuli available in unprecedented quantities with minimal effort. Highly processed foods, explicit visual material, and indeed any substance or behavior that produces dramatic spikes in dopamine, methamphetamine, Min-Run represents an extreme example, can rapidly hijack neural circuitry in similar ways. The circuits that should guide us toward adaptive behaviors instead become captured by these exaggerated, artificial stimuli. They essentially learn the wrong lessons. Path toward recalibrating these circuits involves breaking behaviors down into their essential elements, engaging with them in their most natural, unelaborated forms. This allows the brain to relearn appropriate associations between stimuli and outcomes, between effort and reward, between sensation and genuine satisfaction. The goal involves achieving what we might call a calmer, more prudent version of these neural systems, entering different patterns of hypothalamic activation less prone to being hijacked by supernormal stimuli. Evidence for this approach comes from observations about habituation and sensitization. When exposure to extreme stimuli becomes the norm, less extreme versions lose their effectiveness. Those who consume increasingly intense, explicit visual material often report that previously arousing material no longer produces the same response. This occurs because the brain adapts to whatever level of stimulation becomes routine, requiring progressively more intense stimulation to achieve the same dopaminergic response. This adaptation involves at least two distinct mechanisms. First, there is the direct effect of the stimulus intensity itself. More extreme stimuli produce stronger responses. Second, novelty itself triggers dopamine release independent of other stimulus properties. This means there exists an optimal balance between repetition of familiar patterns and introduction of novel elements. In the context of explicit material consumption, this often manifests as a progression toward increasingly specialized fetishistic content. Pursuit of novelty to maintain dopamine response leads users down pathways they might never have anticipated, seeking ever more unusual material to recreate the initial impact. This represents a particularly dangerous developmental trajectory. Returning to the food analogy, if you began adding increasingly elaborate sauces and seasonings to meat, the plain preparation would eventually seem bland by comparison. Your taste receptors would have adapted to expect high levels of added flavor. Reverting to plain preparations for a sustained period would recalibrate these expectations. Elaborate preparations would begin to seem excessive, even unpleasant, while the simple approach would gradually regain its appeal and satisfaction. Foods consumed in their most straightforward preparations allow the most accurate learning about the relationship between sensory properties and nutritional outcomes. The same principle applies to sexual behavior and response. Engaging with these systems in what might be termed their most naturally satisfying mode, without artificial enhancement or elaboration, allows them to become especially effective at producing genuine satisfaction rather than mere stimulation. Many individuals who describe themselves as trapped in patterns of explicit material consumption emphasize that they derive progressively less satisfaction over time. Even as they feel increasingly unable to stop, the dopamine response diminishes with habituation, yet the compulsive seeking behavior persists, a hallmark of addiction like patterns. A critical additional concern involves developmental effects, particularly for young people whose neural systems retain high plasticity. Evidence suggests that individuals whose sexual response systems develop primarily through consumption of explicit visual material face genuine difficulties establishing functional sexual relationships with actual partners. While learning to navigate intimate relationships with real people has always presented challenges, given the complexity of human sexuality, adding the factor of pornography-mediated sexual development creates additional obstacles. For one thing, explicit material establishes expectations and templates that may not translate well to real-world interactions. More fundamentally, the brain learns to associate arousal with the act of observation rather than participation, essentially training oneself into voyeurism rather than partnership. Adolescents experiencing the intense emergence of sexual drives at puberty, who then spend formative years channeling these drives through observation of explicit material rather than the gradual, awkward, developmentally normal process of learning to interact with real potential partners, the neurological implications remain largely unknown. We simply have no comprehensive understanding of how readily available, highly stimulating explicit visual material affects the development of sexual response systems in young brains. The experiment is ongoing, conducted on an entire generation, with outcomes yet to be determined. The insistent quality of male sexuality at puberty, combined with the immediate availability of supernormal sexual stimuli during this crucial developmental window, creates conditions unprecedented in human history. Young people can successfully transition from consumption of artificial superstimuli to forming genuine, intimate relationships with real partners remains an open question with potentially profound implications for future relationship formation and stability. The neural mechanisms underlying all these phenomena connect to broader principles of how the brain constructs models of the world and guides behavior. The hypothalamus, though often described as a primitive brain region because of its early evolutionary origin and its role in basic drives, actually operates through sophisticated circuitry that integrates information from multiple sources. It receives input from sensory systems, internal physiological monitors, from memory systems, and from regions involved in planning and decision making. When these systems function properly, they create appropriate behavioral inclinations. Hunger when energy stores deplete, thirst when hydration drops, sexual motivation when reproductive opportunities arise. The drives themselves are not problems. They represent essential aspects of being an organism with physical needs and evolutionary imperatives. Problems emerge when the learning mechanisms that should calibrate these drives to appropriate stimuli instead become captured by supernormal stimuli that hijack the system. Think of it this way: the dopamine system evolved as a learning signal to teach organisms which behaviors and stimuli predict genuine fitness benefits. Animals that experienced dopamine release in response to finding nutritious food, securing mates, achieving social status would learn to pursue these outcomes and would consequently survive and reproduce more successfully. The system works beautifully when stimulus intensity and availability remain within evolutionarily normal ranges. The system has no built-in mechanism to distinguish between stimuli that genuinely indicate fitness benefits and artificial stimuli engineered to trigger the same neural responses without providing the advertised benefits. A supernormal stimulus essentially lies to the brain, promising enormous benefits while delivering only the immediate neurochemical signal without the substantive outcome the signal evolved to predict. Consider the economics of this situation from the brain's perspective. Normally, achieving goals that trigger substantial dopamine release requires significant effort and risk. Finding high-quality food demands time, skill, and energy expenditure. Securing romantic and sexual relationships requires social intelligence, emotional regulation, communication skills, and vulnerability to potential rejection. The effort investment makes sense because the payoff, nutrition and reproduction, justifies the cost. Supernormal stimuli bypass the effort requirement. Maximum stimulation for minimal investment. From a naive perspective, this seems beneficial. Getting the reward without the work. The system evolved with the coupling between effort and outcome serving important regulatory functions. When outcomes arrive without proportionate effort, the brain's cost-benefit calculations go awry. Easy access to intense rewards shifts behavioral priorities away from effortful, but genuinely beneficial pursuits toward low-effort sources of neurochemical stimulation. This helps explain the peculiar subjective quality that people describe when caught in compulsive patterns with either explicit material or highly processed foods. They report that the behavior no longer feels particularly pleasurable, yet they feel compelled to continue. This seemingly paradoxical combination makes sense when we understand that the dopamine system involves both motivation, the drive to seek, and pleasure, the experience of getting. These can become decoupled, with motivation persisting even as pleasure diminishes. The wanting continues even when liking fades. Neurobiologically, this occurs because dopamine neurons adapt to chronic stimulation, become less responsive to familiar stimuli through a process called downregulation, the neurons reduce the number of receptors for dopamine on their surfaces, making them less sensitive to the same amount of neurochemical signal. This creates tolerance. The same stimulus produces less response over time, necessitating either more intense stimulation or greater frequency to achieve similar effects. Meanwhile, the pathways driving motivation become increasingly entrenched through repeated activation. Every time the behavioral sequence runs, seeing a cue, experiencing desire, engaging in the behavior, receiving the reward, the neural connections making up that sequence get strengthened. The pattern becomes increasingly automatic, requiring less conscious deliberation to initiate. Eventually, it can trigger almost reflexively in response to subtle cues, boredom, stress, particular times of day, or specific environmental contexts that have become associated with the behavior. This neurological reality explains why simple willpower often proves insufficient to break compulsive patterns. By the time someone recognizes they have a problem, extensive rewiring has already occurred. The circuits driving the behavior have become well established, automatic, and trigger sensitive. Meanwhile, the circuits that should provide competing motivation toward alternative sources of satisfaction, toward long-term goals, self-control, may have atrophied through disuse, becoming weaker relative to the compulsive pattern. Breaking free requires more than deciding to stop. It requires actively building alternative neural pathways while allowing the problematic ones to weaken through disuse. This takes time and typically requires changes to environment and routine to avoid triggering the automatic sequences. It often requires replacing the problematic behavior with alternative sources of satisfaction that engage similar neural systems, but in healthier patterns. Explicit material consumption. This might mean deliberately cultivating real social connections and romantic relationships. The effort and awkwardness this requires compared to digital alternatives. It means accepting that genuine human intimacy will initially seem less stimulating than supernormal stimuli precisely because it is not engineered to maximally trigger arousal systems, and recognizing this as a feature rather than a bug. Real relationships provide something explicit material cannot: reciprocal connection, emotional intimacy, and the satisfaction of being genuinely desired by another person rather than merely consuming images of strangers. For food, related compulsions, recovery involves returning to whole foods consumed in simple preparations, allowing time for taste, preferences, and satiation systems to recalibrate. Initially, whole foods may seem bland compared to the intense flavors of processed options. Portions that should satisfy may not feel adequate because the gut-brain signaling has been trained on misleading combinations. With sustained adherence, the systems relearn. Natural foods begin to taste delicious again. Appropriate portions begin to satisfy. The ability to recognize genuine hunger versus mere appetite returns. In both cases, the process involves a sort of neural retraining, helping the brain relearn associations that were obscured by supernormal stimuli. It means reconnecting with the basic evolved systems that served our ancestors well: eating when genuinely hungry, stopping when satisfied, pursuing real mates with appropriate effort and selectivity rather than settling for artificial substitutes. The broader lesson extends beyond any specific compulsive behavior to questions about how we structure our informational and physical environments. We now possess the technological capability to engineer stimuli that exploit our neural reward systems in ways evolution never anticipated. Science can create combinations of sugar, fat, salt, and various additives calibrated to maximize consumption. Digital technologies can deliver stimuli that trigger arousal, outrage, fear, or excitement in precisely calculated doses designed to capture attention and drive engagement. These capabilities raise profound questions about the kinds of environments we want to inhabit, the kinds of smiling, the kinds of stimuli we want to expose ourselves and especially young people to during crucial developmental periods. The fact that something is possible and profitable does not make it beneficial. The fact that our reward systems respond powerfully to certain stimuli does not mean those stimuli serve our interests. We find ourselves in a historical moment that demands conscious consideration of what earlier generations could take for granted. They lived in environments where the most intense available stimuli corresponded reasonably well to genuinely beneficial outcomes. The sweetest available foods contained valuable nutrients. The most attractive potential mates were actually present and potentially available. Most exciting available activities involved real achievements. Our ancestors could generally trust their appetites and attractions to guide them toward adaptive outcomes. We no longer enjoy that luxury. Our appetites and attractions evolved to function in one world, but now operate in another. The stimuli that most powerfully capture our motivation systems increasingly diverge from those that serve our long-term well-being. This creates what might be called an evolutionary mismatch. Our evolved psychology encounters an environment it was never designed for. Recognizing this mismatch does not mean rejecting modern technology or attempting to return to some imagined simpler past. It means developing wisdom about how to navigate novel environments using old neural equipment. It means recognizing that not every desire should be indulged, not every available stimulus consumed, every technically possible experience pursued. It means developing what earlier traditions might have called virtues like moderation, restraint, and wisdom, capacities to override immediate impulses in service of longer-term well-being. From a neurological perspective, developing these capacities means strengthening particular circuits in the prefrontal cortex involved in behavioral inhibition, term planning, and value-based decision-making. These regions can exert some control over impulse-driven systems, but they require practice and are depleted by stress, fatigue, and competing demands on attention and willpower. Creating environments that reduce temptation becomes important not as a matter of weak will, but as recognition that willpower represents a limited resource easily overwhelmed by sufficiently intense or persistent temptation. This suggests that addressing compulsive behaviors requires both individual and collective action. Individuals can work to restructure their personal environments, avoiding situations that trigger problematic patterns and building alternative sources of satisfaction. We might also consider collective responses, norms, policies, and cultural values that shape the broader environment in which individuals make choices. Societies have taken steps in this direction regarding food, for instance, through restrictions on marketing processed foods to children, labeling requirements that provide nutritional information, or taxes on particularly harmful products. Conversations occur regarding digital technologies, screen time, and age-appropriate access to various forms of content. These debates prove complex because they involve tensions between individual liberty, parental authority, public health, commercial interests. But the core insight remains regardless of specific policy prescriptions. We have created environmental conditions that systematically exploit vulnerabilities in human motivation systems, producing patterns of behavior that people themselves recognize as contrary to their interests yet feel unable to control. This represents a collective challenge requiring thoughtful responses at multiple levels. Understanding the neuroscience helps in several ways. Removes moral judgment from the equation. People caught in compulsive patterns are not weak or immoral, but rather experiencing predictable consequences of how learning and reward systems function when exposed to supernormal stimuli. This understanding can reduce shame, often perpetuates problematic behaviors by driving them into secrecy and preventing people from seeking help. Simultaneously, understanding the mechanisms points toward effective interventions. If the problem involves maladaptive learning by reward systems, the solution involves creating conditions for new learning to occur, reducing exposure to supernormal stimuli, while providing alternative sources of satisfaction that engage similar systems in healthier ways. If the problem involves automatic behavioral sequences triggered by environmental cues, the solution involves identifying and avoiding those triggers while consciously building new sequences. Recovery from any compulsive pattern typically follows a characteristic trajectory. Initially, cessation of the problematic behavior produces discomfort, cravings, irritability, obsessive thoughts about the missing stimulus, restlessness, and difficulty concentrating. These withdrawal-like effects reflect the fact that neural systems have adapted to expect particular patterns of stimulation and must now readjust to functioning without them. This initial period proves the most difficult and the point at which many attempts at change fail. The discomfort feels disproportionate to any perceived benefit of change, especially since the benefits typically take time to manifest while the costs appear immediately. This represents another way supernormal stimuli distort normal functioning. They provide immediate, intense gratification while the beneficial alternatives offer delayed, milder satisfaction. Succeeding through this initial period typically requires some combination of strong motivation, social support, and environmental structure that makes relapse more difficult. Understanding that the discomfort is temporary, predictable phase of neural readjustment can provide the resolve to persist. Many people find that keeping records of their progress, noting both difficulties and small improvements, helps maintain motivation through challenging phases. As time passes, several things begin to shift. The acute cravings diminish in frequency and intensity as dopamine systems readjust their sensitivity. Natural rewards begin to register more powerfully as the brain's responsiveness to moderate stimuli recovers. Alternative behaviors practiced consistently begin to establish their own neural pathways, creating new automatic sequences that can compete with and eventually replace the problematic ones. The effort required to maintain change gradually decreases as new patterns become established. For many people, this recovery process produces unexpected benefits beyond simply eliminating a problematic behavior. As reward systems recalibrate, they often discover that many things become more satisfying. Food tastes richer, accomplishments feel more meaningful, interactions become more engaging. This occurs because chronic exposure to supernormal stimuli had essentially numbed their capacity to experience pleasure from normal life experiences. Removing the supernormal stimuli allows normal sensitivity to return. Additionally, the time and mental energy previously consumed by compulsive behaviors become available for other pursuits. People often report surprise at how much time they had been dedicating to a behavior they described as not even particularly enjoyable. Freed from that commitment, they rediscover interests and activities they had neglected, reconnect with people, pursue goals they had abandoned. These positive developments create an upward spiral, the mirror image of the downward spiral of addiction, where compulsive behavior had progressively narrowed their lives, focusing time and attention on obtaining and consuming particular stimuli while other areas atrophied. Recovery progressively expands possibility as diverse sources of satisfaction return to awareness and accessibility. Of course, recovery rarely proceeds smoothly. Relapses occur, periods where old patterns resurface despite intentions and efforts to the contrary. These represent predictable aspects of the recovery process rather than failures. The neural pathways underlying compulsive behaviors do not disappear immediately upon deciding to change. They weaken gradually through disuse, but can quickly reactivate if triggered. Understanding this helps frame relapses as learning opportunities rather than catastrophic failures, chances to identify triggering situations or emotional states and develop better strategies for managing them. Some triggers prove relatively straightforward to identify and avoid particular websites, specific times of day, certain mood states. Others prove more subtle. An underlying sense of emptiness, difficulties with intimacy, unprocessed trauma, or existential concerns about meaning and purpose. Compulsive behaviors often serve as attempted solutions to these deeper issues, providing temporary escape or relief. Addressing the underlying concerns becomes essential for lasting change. This points toward a limitation of purely neurobiological explanations. While understanding dopamine, reward circuits, and learning mechanisms provides crucial insight into how compulsive patterns develop and persist, it does not fully explain why particular individuals become vulnerable or what sustains motivation for change. Here, psychological, social, and even philosophical dimensions become relevant. Do some people exposed to supernormal stimuli develop compulsive patterns while others do not? Partly, this reflects individual variation in neural sensitivity and reward responsiveness. Genetic factors influence dopamine receptor density and function, affecting how powerfully stimuli trigger these systems. But psychological factors also matter: stress, trauma, insecure attachment, depression, anxiety, and social isolation all increase vulnerability to developing problematic relationships with intensely rewarding stimuli. The explicit material consumption pattern described earlier often develops in the context of broader difficulties with social connection and intimacy. Young people who feel socially awkward or excluded, who struggle with anxiety about potential rejection, who lack frameworks for understanding how to navigate romantic and sexual relationships, may retreat into patterns that provide stimulation without social risk. The behavior then interferes with developing the skills and experiences that would enable real relationships, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Breaking this cycle requires more than just abstaining from explicit material. It demands developing social competence, processing whatever fears or traumas interfere with intimacy, and gradually building capacity for the vulnerability and complexity that real relationships entail. This represents difficult developmental work. Avoiding it leaves people trapped in patterns they recognize as unsatisfying yet feel unable to escape. Dynamics apply to food-related compulsions, which often develop in the context of emotional regulation difficulties. Food becomes a way to manage uncomfortable feelings, stress, sadness, anxiety, boredom, loneliness. The intense neurochemical stimulation from highly palatable processed foods temporarily disrupts whatever emotional discomfort drove the eating, creating a powerful reinforcement loop. But the underlying emotional issues remain unaddressed, continuing to drive repeated episodes. Again, lasting change requires addressing root causes rather than just managing symptoms. This might involve learning alternative strategies for emotional regulation, processing traumatic experiences, addressing depression or anxiety, building social connections that provide support and meaning. Compulsive behavior must be recognized as an attempted solution to genuine problems, albeit an ultimately counterproductive one. This integrated perspective, understanding both the neurobiological mechanisms and the psychological context, provides the most complete picture of how compulsive patterns develop and how recovery occurs. The neuroscience explains the mechanics of habit formation and reward learning. The psychology explains individual vulnerability and sustained motivation. Neither level of explanation is complete without the other. We might also consider a sociocultural dimension to these questions. Prevalence of various compulsive behaviors has increased dramatically in recent decades, coinciding with particular changes in how we structure our societies, and particularly in how commercial enterprises operate. Industries have become progressively more sophisticated at designing products and experiences that maximize engagement by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. Companies employ teams of scientists to engineer products that trigger optimal combinations of neurochemical responses. Digital platforms use elaborate algorithms to serve content calculated to maximize attention capture and engagement time. Each refinement in these systems makes them more effective at hijacking motivation and reward mechanisms. We face what amounts to an arms race between human self-regulation capacities and increasingly sophisticated technologies of manipulation. Argue this simply represents markets giving people what they want, persistent demand proving that the products serve genuine preferences. This analysis ignores the fact that sophisticated manipulation can create and shape preferences rather than merely satisfying pre-existing ones. When corporations spend billions of dollars employing insights from neuroscience and psychology to design experiences that bypass conscious decision making and trigger automatic responses, calling the outcome voluntary choice becomes questionable. This does not necessarily imply that corporate actors operate with malicious intent. Most people working in these industries probably see themselves as creating products that bring pleasure or value to consumers. The competitive dynamics of markets create strong pressures toward maximizing certain metrics, sales, engagement time, purchases, regardless of whether this serves consumers' broader interests. A company that voluntarily constrained its products to be less addictive would likely lose market share to less scrupulous competitors. These structural issues suggest that addressing compulsive consumption patterns requires attention not just to individual behavior change, but also to the systems producing and marketing supernormal stimuli. Involve various policy approaches, regulations limiting marketing practices, especially those targeting children, requirements for clearer information about product contents and effects, taxes that make problematic products bear more of their social costs, support for technologies and platforms designed with human well-being rather than maximal engagement as their primary objective. Approaches involve inevitable tensions and trade-offs between different values, liberty versus paternalism, innovation versus precaution, commercial interests versus public health. Reasonable people disagree about where to strike these balances. The conversation itself becomes essential as we increasingly recognize that our current trajectory toward ever more sophisticated stimuli designed to capture attention and drive consumption produces consequences many people find deeply troubling. Returning to the individual level, what practical wisdom can we extract from this understanding? Several principles emerge as central to navigating an environment full of supernormal stimuli without becoming trapped in compulsive patterns. First, cultivate awareness of your own patterns. Notice what triggers cravings or compulsive behaviors. Times, places, emotional states, contexts. This requires honest self-observation without judgment. You cannot change patterns you do not recognize. Second, structure your environment to support the behaviors you want rather than those you wish to avoid. Make problematic stimuli less accessible. Remove triggering cues from your regular environment. Build in friction between impulse and action, delays or obstacles that give conscious deliberation a chance to intervene. Third, alternative sources of satisfaction that engage similar neural systems but in healthier ways. If food has been your primary source of pleasure, cultivate other enjoyable activities. Explicit material has been your main outlet for sexual interest. Work on developing capacity for real intimacy, even though this proves more challenging. Fourth, address underlying issues that may be driving compulsive behaviors. Work on emotional regulation, social skills, unprocessed trauma, whatever psychological factors increase your vulnerability. Consider professional support if needed. Fifth, practice self-compassion alongside accountability. Recognize that struggling with these patterns reflects normal human neurobiology encountering an abnormal environment rather than personal moral failure. Also acknowledge your agency. You can make choices that gradually reshape your neural systems toward better functioning. 6, accept that change takes time and involves setbacks. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself, enables recovery but operates gradually. The circuits underlying compulsive behaviors formed over months or years and will not disappear overnight. Persistence through difficulties becomes essential. 7th, recognize the value of community and support. Changing deeply entrenched patterns while navigating an environment full of triggering stimuli proves extremely difficult in isolation. Others who understand the struggle can provide encouragement, accountability, practical suggestions, and hope during difficult periods. These principles apply across different types of compulsive behaviors because they address the common underlying dynamics. Reward system hijacking, automatic behavioral sequences, environmental triggers, psychological vulnerability factors. Tactics may vary depending on whether the target is food, explicit material, social media, gambling, any other potentially problematic stimulus, but the basic framework remains consistent. One aspect deserving particular emphasis involves the relationship between stress and vulnerability to compulsive patterns. Stress exerts multiple effects that increase susceptibility. It depletes the prefrontal resources needed for self-control, making it harder to override automatic impulses. It amplifies the brain's responsiveness to reward, making stimuli trigger stronger responses. It motivates seeking immediate relief rather than pursuing long-term well-being. These combined effects mean that managing stress becomes central to managing compulsive behaviors. Effective stress management looks different for different people, but typically involves some combination of adequate sleep, regular physical activity, social connection, time in nature, practices like meditation or deep breathing that activate the parasympathetic nervous system, working to address chronic sources of stress where possible. These might seem tangential to dealing with specific compulsive behaviors, but they directly impact the neural systems regulating impulse control and reward sensitivity. Similarly, the quality of social connections profoundly influences vulnerability to compulsive patterns. Humans are deeply social creatures whose well-being depends heavily on meaningful relationships. Social isolation, loneliness, lack of intimate connection create states of chronic stress and deprivation that increase seeking of alternative sources of reward and comfort. Many compulsive behaviors essentially represent attempts to self-medicate the pain of disconnection. This means that building and maintaining genuine relationships,